The frost still clung to the grass when the first of the longships eased into the sheltered bay. Their dragon-headed prows cut the pale morning mist, and the sound of the oars echoed against the stone cliffs like the steady beat of a war drum. On the narrow strand, men and women gathered in tense silence, wrapped in heavy cloaks against the bitter air. Today would not be a day for feasting. Today would be decided by blood. The duel had been called at the Thing, the great assembly where free men spoke their claims, settled disputes, and swore oaths. For months, two rival chieftains had contested the same stretch of river valley, rich farmland, good for cattle, and the only easy passage between the coast and the inland trade routes. Raids had already been exchanged. A lesser feud might have erupted into open war, drawing in dozens of clans, but here a different path was chosen. One fight, two champions, the fate of the valley hanging in the balance. On the field, a circle had already been marked. 4 paces wide, it was bordered with a strip of freshly cut turf laid over the frozen ground, the way it had been done for generations. Within it lay an ox hide, pegged down at the corners with wooden stakes. The circle was sacred, step outside its bounds during the duel, and the fight was lost. It was as much a cage for honor as for bodies. At the northern edge stood the first champion, his fur-lined cloak thrown back, steam curling from his mouth with every breath. Hrolf Ketilsson, a man of great breadth and the scarred face of one who had known many winters. In his right hand he held a long-handled axe, its iron head dark with age, its edge honed to a glimmering line. He had fought in Ireland, in the lands of the Franks, and deep into the Slavic forests. His loyalty was to Jarl Svein, the coastal lord whose ships now stood ready in the bay. Opposite him waited Einar of Crossfjord, taller, younger, but no less dangerous. His beard was bound with silver rings, his mail shirt glinting in the pale light. In his grip was a sword of Frankish steel, patterned like flowing water, its hilt worn smooth from years of use. The men who sailed with him whispered that he had once split a man from collarbone to belly with a single stroke. He was champion to Jarl Hakon, ruler of the inland hall. Between the two warriors, the law speaker stood. His voice was slow and deliberate, carrying the ritual words across the hush. This duel is sworn before the gods and before men. Let each warrior fight as he will, until one falls, or yields, or flees the circle. The winner shall hold the river valley, its waters, and its fields, by right of trial and combat. Both men nodded. This was no quarrel of hot-headed youths, it was a legal reckoning. When the law failed to end a feud, the duel was the only remaining truth. A horn sounded from the watching crowd, deep and mournful. The air seemed to tighten. Einar adjusted his grip, rolling his shoulders to loosen them. Hrolf lowered his head slightly, eyes fixed on his opponent. They began to circle, slow steps crunching the frost beneath their boots. The world beyond the marked ground seemed to fade the longships, the silent crowd, even the grey sky. All that remained was the rhythm of boots on frozen turf, the faint creak of leather, the distant caw of a raven watching from the tree line. Einar struck first, a sudden lunge, his sword arcing in a gleam of steel toward Hrolf's shoulder. The older man caught it on the haft of his axe, the shock travelling up his arm. He twisted, shoving Einar back a pace, and swung low for the legs, forcing his opponent to leap aside, skirting dangerously close to the boundary. Gasps rose from the crowd. One step too far, and the fight would end in shame. But Einar steadied, the cold air clouding around his face. They came together again, blows ringing in the morning stillness. The axe crashed against the shield Einar now raised, wood splintering. The sword flashed, biting into the rim of the axe head, sticking for a heartbeat before wrenching free. Sparks leapt in the pale light. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, a man began to murmur an old verse, a prayer to Odin, the chooser of the slain. Others joined him in whispers. The duel was more than a fight. It was a calling of fate. The gods, they believed, had already chosen the victor. The two men were merely acting out what had been woven long before in the unseen threads of destiny. As the duel wore on, boots slipped in the frost, breaths came harsher, and each strike seemed heavier than the last. Blood welled from a cut on Einar's cheek, dark against the cold. Rolf's left shoulder sagged slightly from a blow he had taken earlier. Neither man yielded. The horn that had begun the fight still lay in the hands of the herald. He would not sound it again until one man fell. And when that moment came, whether by blade, by exhaustion, or by the misstep of crossing the circle, the future of an entire valley, and perhaps the course of the coming season's raids, would be decided in the space of a single breath. The clash between Hrolf Ketilsson and Einar of Crossfjord was no mere brawl between warriors. It was a holmgang, one of the most ancient and feared traditions of the Viking world. The word itself comes from the Old Norse holmer, meaning islet or small island, and ganga, walk, or go. In the earliest days, these duels were often fought quite literally on tiny spits of land, surrounded by water, where no man could flee without leaping into the cold embrace of the sea. In time, the name remained even when the place changed. Any designated patch of ground could become a holm if marked for combat. A holmgang was more than a fight. It was a court, a judgment, and a ritual rolled into one. When two men could not agree on the ownership of land, the repayment of a debt, or the truth of an accusation, they could call for trial by combat. The law might be written, but it was the gods who were believed to choose the victor. If a man was in the right, Odin would see his arm was strong and his aim true. If he was in the wrong, the Norns, the weavers of fate, would let him fall. In theory, a holmgang could prevent greater bloodshed. Two champions fought, the loser's claim was forfeit, and the matter was settled. Entire families, even whole villages, could avoid the ruin of a drawn-out feud. But in practice, holmgangs often fueled rivalries. Instead of ending them for losing could mean shame, loss of honor, and the bitter thirst for revenge. It began at the Thing, the Great Assembly, where free men gathered under open sky to decide matters of law. A man would step forward before the assembled crowd, name his grievance, and challenge his enemy to meet him in holmgang. The accused could refuse, but to do so was to brand oneself a coward in the eyes of the law and the people. In many places, refusal meant automatic loss of the dispute. Once accepted, a date and place were set. Witnesses were chosen, often elders or respected warriors, to see that the fight was carried out by the rules. The duel would take place within a fixed period, sometimes within 3 days, sometimes as long as a fortnight, giving each side time to prepare. On the morning of the duel, the combat ground was prepared with deliberate ceremony. The most common space was a square of ground, roughly the length of an ox hide, the hide pegged to the earth at the corners with wooden stakes. In Iceland, the law dictated a cloak or hide 3 ells square, bordered by a line that neither fighter could cross without forfeiting the fight. In other regions, it might be a circle drawn in the soil or a roped-off square on a riverbank. Some warriors preferred to fight on small islands, keeping to the oldest form of the tradition. Here, the icy waters themselves acted as the boundary. Retreat meant drowning or defeat. Each man brought his own arms. The most common weapons for holmgang were swords, often Frankish steel of superb craftsmanship, or battle axes with long, sweeping blades. Spears were sometimes used, and shields were always present. A man could use as many shields as he could carry, but once they were shattered, and they often shattered quickly, he was left bare before his opponent's blows. The rules varied from place to place, but generally a man could carry several shields into the fight, replacing them as they broke. When the last shield was gone, only skill, speed, and fate stood between him and death. Victory in a holmgang brought more than honor. It could mean ownership of disputed land, the settling of debts, or even the right to another man's property. In some sagas, men fought holmgang to win the hand of a bride, the victor claiming both woman and dowry. The loser's family might be forced to pay a heavy wergild, the man price for his death, unless the duel was declared to the death, with no such payment. And for the defeated warrior himself, the penalty was final: death, exile, or utter disgrace. Among Norsemen, a man's reputation was his most valuable possession. To die in a holmgang could still be seen as an honourable end, but to lose and live as a broken man was often a fate worse than the sword. Though it was a matter of killing, holmgang was bound tightly to the laws and customs of the Viking world. The duel had to be witnessed and its rules followed, for it was seen as an act of justice, not murder. Breaking the rules, attacking before the signal, striking outside the agreed weapons, crossing the boundary deliberately could turn a warrior into an outlaw, hunted and despised. In this way, the holmgang stood at the strange meeting place between violence and law, between sacred ritual and raw bloodshed. It was war reduced to its most personal form, one man's strength, courage, and skill pitted against another's, with the gods themselves believed to be watching. And as the law speaker's words faded on that frost-bitten morning by the bay, Hrolf and Einar stepped closer to one another, their breath mingling in the cold air. The crowd leaned in. Somewhere above, the ravens circled. The trial had begun. The holmgang circle was more than a patch of ground. It was a border between the living world and the realm of fate. Every step inside it carried the weight of law, tradition, and the silent judgment of the gods. The moment the turf was marked and the stakes driven into the earth, the land within became sacred. No one but the duelists and the law speaker could enter. Even the wind seemed to move differently there, as if aware it crossed into a place where men lived or died by ancient decree. The choice of location mattered. In the earliest days, many holmgangs were fought on actual islets, narrow strips of rock or sand just large enough to hold two men and a few paces of ground between them. The sea was the truest, most impartial witness, cold, tireless, and merciless. It surrounded the combatants on all sides. No one could flee without leaping into its freezing grasp, where death awaited just as surely as the edge of a sword. In these duels, the sound of waves striking rock was the only audience apart from the gulls and the gods. Later, as the practice spread inland, the island became a matter of symbolism rather than geography. The same word was used, but the place could be anywhere that the community agreed upon. A sandy riverbank, a flat meadow beside the thing, the hard-packed ground outside a hall. The chosen patch would be marked out with great care. In Iceland, the law prescribed that a hide 3 ells square, the length of 3 extended arms, should be pegged taut to the ground with 4 wooden stakes. Elsewhere, the ground might be roped off, or the boundaries marked with a line cut into the turf. However it was made, the border was absolute. Once the hide was pegged or the rope tied, the holm was transformed. It became a world apart. Inside, only the duelists and the law had power. Outside, even the nearest kin could not raise a hand to help. This separation was the very essence of the holmgang. It was the stripping away of all advantage except the man's own skill, strength, and resolve. The rules of the boundary were simple, but they were enforced with an almost religious severity. A fighter could be pressed to the very edge, his heels grazing the line, his enemy's weapon hammering at his guard, but if even 1 foot crossed beyond that sacred limit, he was finished. To step out was to yield. Yielding meant losing not only the fight, but also the claim that had brought him there. The land, the silver, the honor, whatever prize had been at stake. It could mean walking away alive, but marked forever as a man who could not stand his ground. It was not unheard of for a duel to end in such a way. Some fighters, seeing death closing in, chose to step out rather than spill their blood on the hide. But among the proudest warriors, such a choice was worse than death itself. To live as a coward was to have one's name rotted from the inside out. A man who yielded would find feasts grown quiet when he entered, would see old friends turn their eyes away, would hear the whispers follow him down the longhouse. This is why the crowd, even if it seethed with factional hatred, respected the invisible wall of the home. Men who might gladly have strangled each other a day earlier would stand shoulder to shoulder as they watched 2 rivals step into the circle. If one man crossed the line in victory, the other had no more right to be struck. The fight was over. The law had spoken. And yet, the circle was no mere cage. For the fighter who stood within it, it was also a sanctuary. Outside the border, chaos ruled. Allies, kinsmen, ambushers, all could tip the scales. Inside the home, there was only one enemy. No tricks of numbers, no sudden rain of arrows, no third blade striking from the shadows. For a man certain in his skill, it was the purest chance to prove himself. That purity made the duel more terrifying for many than the crush of battle. In war, a man could hide in the shield wall, could win or lose without his own sword deciding the matter. In the holmgang, there was no one to lean on. Every strike and every step was his own. The eyes of the crowd, of his ancestors, and of the gods were on him alone. The duel began when the law speaker, standing just outside the border, spoke the ritual words that opened the trial. In some places, he would recite the exact terms of the dispute. In others, he would call on the gods to watch and judge. When the last word fell, the fighters would step to the center, shields raised, weapons ready. The hide beneath their boots might feel oddly soft and springing, or taut and unyielding, depending on the ground. Many believed it carried an energy of its own, the memory of all the blood that had soaked into it from duels past. Some warriors would whisper prayers before stepping into the ring. Tyr, god of law and battle, was a common choice. Others called on Odin, who could grant victory to the bold and doom the proud in the same breath. There were men who spat on the hide for luck, or who tapped their weapons twice on the boundary stakes as they crossed. These gestures, small and private, were their way of acknowledging the gravity of what they were about to do. Once inside, the fighters began their measured circling, boots brushing against turf and hide. Their attention narrowed to the man before them, to the faint shifts of weight that might precede a strike. Beyond the circle, the faces of kin and strangers alike blurred to a haze. The law speaker's voice became a distant echo. All that mattered was the opponent, the weapon in hand, and the unbroken line that enclosed them. It was here, in this small patch of earth, that destinies could shift. A single clean blow could change the course of a feud, could win a bride, could claim a farmstead, or a stretch of grazing land. One slip of the foot could cost a man his life or his good name. The holmgang was not just a fight, it was the visible shape of the law itself, drawn on the ground for all to see. And so the circle, whether an actual island lashed by the sea or a square of hide pegged to the frost, held a power beyond its size. To outsiders it might seem a crude thing, a scrap of land, a few paces across. But for those who stood on its edge, watching the champion step forward, it was as vast as the battlefield and as final as the grave. On that cold morning by the bay, the stakes were no different. The hide lay stretched and staked, its corners anchored deep in the earth. The crowd kept a respectful distance. Hrolf and Einar both knew that once they crossed into that sacred space, there would be no return without victory or disgrace. As they stepped forward, their boots pressed into the hide, and the line of the world itself seemed to draw tight around them. Beyond it, there was nothing. Within it, there was everything. In the holmgang, a man's weapon was more than a tool of killing. It was a declaration of who he was, where he came from, and how he intended to meet his fate. Every stroke, every parry, every splintered shield was an extension of his will, but also a reflection of his place in the world. A poor man might step into the circle with nothing more than a plain spear and a round of firwood for a shield. A wealthy or well-connected champion could carry a sword forged in the Frankish heartlands, the steel folded and patterned in rippling waves, its edge sharp enough to shear through mail and bone alike. The difference between the two was not just in power, it was in the message it sent to the crowd. The sword was the weapon of prestige. Among the Norse, it was never common. Swords required more skill and time to forge than axes or spears, and they demanded far more iron. The finest came from workshops far to the south, bought through trade or taken as plunder. A Frankish sword was a treasure, worth the value of a farm. It was long and straight, with a double-edged blade, balanced so a man could cut or thrust with equal force. When polished, the steel gleamed like ice under the winter sun. In the duel circle, the sight of such a blade drew murmurs from the crowd. It meant its bearer was no wandering farmhand, but a man of standing or a man with powerful friends. Yet many champions favoured the axe, and for good reason. An axe was the child of the forest, as much a tool as a weapon, familiar in every hand from youth. In war, a well-made axe could cleave through a helmet or shear the rim from a shield in a single blow. Its head was wedge-shaped, narrowing to a brutal edge, and many were bearded the lower part of the blade extending downward in a hook that could drag an opponent's shield aside or pull his weapon arm open for the killing stroke. A long-handled axe could strike from just outside sword's reach, forcing an enemy to close the distance at his peril. In the hands of a strong man, it was a terrifying thing to face. The spear was older still, the weapon of Odin himself. Simple in shape, deadly in use, it could be wielded with one hand behind a shield or in two hands for greater reach. Some duelists brought spears tipped with leaf-shaped blades. Others favoured narrower points designed to pierce mail. In the circle, a spear could keep a foe at bay, probing for openings, forcing him to defend before he could strike back. Yet, in the confined space of the holmgang, the spear's length was both a blessing and a curse, too long to manoeuvre easily, too short to dominate the fight entirely. Shields were as vital as any weapon. No man would step into the holmgang without one, unless arrogance or some strange point of honour demanded it. The round shield was a warrior's constant companion, light enough to move quickly, broad enough to hide most of the body, strong enough to turn a sword stroke aside. In duels, shields often shattered. The oak planks split under heavy blows, the boss dented, the rim chewed away until the board hung in tatters. For this reason, duelists often brought several shields into the ring, setting spares just beyond the edge to be taken up as needed. But there was a limit. The more shields a man needed, the more it suggested weakness. The great champions were those who could end the fight before their first shield was ruined. Every weapon bore its own history. Blades were passed down through families, each with a name and a story of victories won. A sword might be spoken of as if it had a will of its own, quick to strike, hungry for blood, loyal to the worthy. Some axes had been buried with warriors and later taken up again, the haft replaced, but the head still bearing the marks of old battles. The haft of a spear might be carved with runes, each stroke cut with the hope of turning fate in its wielder's favour. Even shields carried symbols, painted dragons, wolves, and eagles that turned the shield wall into a parade of fierce totems. For the holmgang, the choice of weapon was as much about strategy as tradition. A man facing an agile swordsman might take an axe, hoping to batter his way through with strength. Against a towering axeman, a quick blade could slip through in the gaps between strikes. The law allowed each fighter to choose his arms freely, but once chosen, they could not be changed mid-duel. This meant a warrior had to know his own strengths, as well as the weaknesses of his foe before the first step into the ring. There were tricks known to experienced duelists. An axeman might hook the rim of his opponent's shield and wrench it aside to open the body for a killing cut. A spearman could feint low to draw the guard downward, then drive the point up toward the face. A swordsman might slide the flat of his blade along the edge of a shield to strike at the hand gripping it. In close quarters, even the butt of a weapon could be turned into a tool of sudden violence, smashing into a jaw or cracking ribs. But there was more to a weapon than the edge it carried. To step into the holmgang with a fine sword or a heavy axe was to show the crowd that you had the right to be there, that your skill, your wealth, or your deeds had earned you the arms of a warrior. It was a silent boast, a claim to honor made before the first blow was struck. A ragged farmer's spear could still kill, but it would not stir the same awe as a named sword that had drunk the blood of 10 men. On that cold morning by the bay, Hrolf carried an axe older than some of the men in the crowd, its edge polished and gleaming in the pale light. The haft bore the dark stain of age and oil, the wood polished smooth by years of use. Across from him, Einar's sword caught the sun in a bright flare, its patterned steel running like frozen water down the blade. Each man had chosen not only the weapon he trusted, but the one that spoke to the crowd of his station and his style. As they tightened their grips, the circle seemed to shrink around them. The axe promised crushing power, the sword whispered of swift precision. The outcome would be written in steel. And in the silent judgment of the gods, it mattered little which weapon was finer, only which hand wielded it truer when the moment came to kill. Before a sword was drawn or an axe lifted, the holmgang was first a matter of law. It might end in a man's blood soaking the ground, but it began with words, oaths, and formalities as binding as any chain. Without these, the fight was not a holmgang at all, it was murder, and the killer would be cast out as an outlaw, stripped of all rights. The Norse understood that even killing had to be given the cloak of justice. The challenge itself was the first step, and it was a serious one. A man did not lightly demand that another meet him in the holmgang. To issue the challenge meant you were prepared to stake your claim, your honor, and perhaps your life on the outcome. This was usually done at the Thing, the great assembly where men gathered to settle disputes, hear the law spoken, and decide matters of trade and governance. There, before witnesses and often in the hearing of hundreds, a man would declare his grievance. He might accuse another of theft, of false oaths, of encroaching on his land, or refusing rightful payment. Once the grievance was spoken, the challenge would follow, as plain and cold as a winter wind. I call you to the holm. It was a sentence that cut through all other talk. The man challenged could not pretend he had not heard. His answer had to be clear. If he accepted, the matter moved forward under the rules of the duel. If he refused, the refusal itself was taken as an admission of defeat, and worse, of cowardice. The law often allowed the challenger to claim victory in the dispute, simply because the other man lacked the courage to face him. If the challenge was accepted, a time and place were agreed upon. Sometimes this was within 3 days. In other cases, it could be set for a fortnight later. The delay allowed both men to put their affairs in order, to choose their weapons, to prepare in body and spirit. In that time, rumors would run through the settlement. Friends and kin would gather advice, train in private, and watch the rivals' movements for signs of readiness or fear. The coming duel would be on everyone's tongue. Witnesses were appointed, usually respected men of the community, often elders or skilled warriors themselves. Their duty was to see that the duel was conducted fairly, that the rules were observed, and that the result was beyond dispute. They were the eyes of the law, and their presence gave the holmgang its legitimacy. Without them, the fight was nothing more than a brawl in a field. The rules themselves varied between regions. In Iceland, the law was exact. The fighting ground was to be marked by a cloak or hide 3 ells square, pegged at the corners. The fighters would bring 3 shields each, and could replace them as they were broken. A fighter who stepped beyond the edge of the hide yielded the fight. Blows could be struck until one man was dead, disabled, or unwilling to continue. In Norway, some rules were different, more shields allowed, or the fighting ground larger, or the combat ending with the first serious wound. In all cases, the structure was meant to keep the fight contained, to give both men a clear chance, and to prevent the duel from spilling into chaos. Before stepping into the circle, both men were required to swear an oath that they would fight by the rules. This was not done lightly. Oaths in the Viking world were sacred things, binding before the gods as well as before men. To swear falsely was to invite ruin not just in this life, but in the next. The oath might be sworn on the hilt of a sword, on a ring of silver kept by the law speaker for such purposes, or even on the very boundary of the home itself. Each man swore to fight honorably, to accept the outcome, and to abide by the judgment that followed. The law also set limits on what could be demanded by duel. Some disputes were too trivial to be settled with blood, while others were too grave for a mere duel to decide. But in practice, many men stretched these limits. Land, silver, marriage rights, and matters of deep personal insult were all common causes for holmgang. In some cases, men were even known to provoke disputes for the express purpose of calling a weaker opponent to the duel, winning by skill or intimidation, and taking the loser's property. The crowd knew the law as well as the fighters did. They had heard it spoken at the thing since they were children, memorized in the same way they memorized the sagas. This was part of why the holmgang drew so many onlookers. It was not only a spectacle of violence, it was the law made flesh, a trial played out before their eyes. They came to see justice as much as to see blood. When the day came, the combatants arrived at the chosen ground with their witnesses and supporters. The law speaker, or his appointed herald, would step into the center and call for silence. Then, in a clear voice, he would speak the terms of the fight, the names of the combatants, the grievance that had brought them there, the rules under which they would fight. His words were as binding as chains, and both men were expected to listen in stillness, even as their blood surged with the need to act. Sometimes there were formal gestures before the fight began. In some traditions, the fighters touched the tips of their weapons together, acknowledging the other as a worthy foe. In others, they circled the hide once before taking their first guard. These customs varied, but they all carried the same meaning, that the fight was entered freely, and that the gods and men alike would bear witness. Once all was spoken, the law speaker gave the signal. This might be a word, a gesture, or the sounding of a horn. From that moment, the law stepped back, and the weapons took over. The fight was now in the hands of the 2 men within the circle, and in the will of the gods who watched from above. The crowd leaned in, the witnesses fixed their eyes, and the first blow would fall. The holmgang was thus both the most savage and the most controlled form of combat the Norse knew. It was the violence of war stripped down to its essence, yet bound in the cords of custom and law. Before the first blow was struck, both men had already passed through a trial, the trial of summoning the courage to stand before their enemy in the full sight of their people, to swear their oaths, and to place their fate in the narrow space between 2 boundaries. On that morning by the bay, the law had been spoken, the oaths had been sworn. The crowd was silent now, waiting for the signal. Somewhere above, a raven turned in slow circles, as if it too knew that the moment was at hand. Not every man who stood within the holmgang circle fought for his own quarrel. In the world of the Vikings, a man could fight as another's hand, a champion chosen to bear the burden of the duel. This was not only accepted, but respected, for the Norse understood that a quarrel between leaders was rarely just a matter between 2 men. It was the clash of whole households, the weight of alliances, the pride of clans. Sending a champion could save the life of a chieftain whose death would plunge a community into chaos, or allow an elder statesman to protect his claim without risking his own sword arm in the ring. The choosing of a champion was never done lightly. It was a mark of trust, deeper than kinship. For in the duel, the champion's honor and skill would become the honor and skill of the man he fought for. The victory would be counted as the claimant's own, The defeat would shame him as if he had fallen himself. A chieftain who sent a poor fighter in his place risked not only losing the case but losing face before his allies and rivals alike. Champions were often men of proven renown, warriors whose names were already spoken with respect around the fire. They could be loyal retainers, sworn to the chieftain's service by oaths and long years of comradeship. Sometimes they were bloodkin, a brother or son eager to uphold the family's name. In rare cases, they could even be hired bladesmen whose loyalty was bought with silver or the promise of land, but whose skill with weapon and shield was beyond doubt. To fight as a champion was a role both glorious and perilous. It was glorious because the duel gave a man the chance to prove himself before the eyes of the community and the gods. A victory could make his reputation overnight, turning him into the man others sought when the stakes were highest. Yet it was perilous because a champion carried more than his own life into the circle. His failure could bring ruin on another's name, stain an entire household's honor, and unravel alliances carefully built over years. Some champions carried the weight easily, swaggering into the holmgang with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. Others bore it like a millstone, quiet and grim, knowing that their skill alone stood between their lord and humiliation. The chieftain who stood behind them could offer no help. Once the fight began, only watch in silence as the fate of his claim was fought over in the narrow space of the ring. History and saga are rich with tales of champions whose victories decided the course of feuds and even wars. One story tells of Thorstein the Black, champion to Jarl Erik of the Fjords, who fought 3 holmgangs in a single summer, each against a rival chieftain's man. Thorstein's victories not only secured Erik's disputed lands but forced the rival jarls into an uneasy peace, unwilling to lose more men to Erik's seemingly unstoppable champion. For years afterward, Erik's enemies spoke of him with wariness, knowing that to challenge him in the holmgang was to risk meeting Thorstein across the Hyde. The role of champion could also be used as a political message. A chieftain might choose his champion not only for skill, but for the impression the choice would make. To send a young and untested fighter could be a calculated insult, a way of saying that the opponent was not worthy of a seasoned warrior's attention. To send a fearsome berserker could be a show of strength, warning the rival of what kind of fury awaited should matters escalate beyond the duel. In every case, the choice of champion was part of the duel's strategy, as important as the choice of weapon or the timing of the challenge. In some instances, the champion himself was the one who sought out the fight. Loyal warriors might provoke disputes on behalf of their chieftains, knowing that the duel would bring them both honor if won. This was a dangerous game, for it skirted the line between lawful combat and manipulation of the law for personal gain. Yet in a world where reputation was as valuable as silver, such risks were often taken. The laws recognized the right of a man to send a champion, but they also bound him to the result. If the champion lost, the claimant could not argue that he had been poorly represented. The duel's outcome was final, and its judgment fell on the one for whom the champion fought as surely as if he had taken the blow himself. This made the choice of champion a matter of careful calculation. The strongest sword arm did not always belong to the wisest head, and some champions were known to let pride or fury carry them beyond the bounds of the rules, costing their lords dearly. On the morning of the duel, the champion would stand forward in the claimant's place when the law speaker called the names. He would swear the oaths, take up the weapons, and step into the circle under the gaze of all assembled. The man he fought for might stand just beyond the boundary, close enough to see every movement, far enough to be powerless to aid him. Their eyes might meet across the narrow space, a silent exchange of trust and expectation. When the champion won, the victory was sweet to both men. The claimant's honor was upheld, his claim secured, his standing often increased by the prowess of his chosen fighter. The champion's own name would rise in the telling, his deeds carried in song and story to the next thing, and the one after that. Silver and gifts often followed a fine cloak, a drinking horn, a weapon newly forged. Yet the greatest reward was the bond between champion and chieftain, a loyalty deepened in blood. But when the champion lost, the shame could be crushing. The claimant bore the loss of his claim and the shadow of defeat over his name. The champion carried the knowledge that he had failed not only himself, but another who had trusted him completely. In some cases, such failures ended the bond between them. In others, the loyalty endured, tempered by hardship, but the memory of the loss would live on, whispered in the corners of halls whenever the old duels were remembered. On that frostbitten morning by the bay, Rolf Ketilsson did not fight for his own quarrel. He was the chosen champion of Jarl Svein, whose claim to the fertile river valley had been challenged by Jarl Hakon of the Inland Hall. Across from him, Einar of Crossfjord stood in the same role for Hakon, sword in hand, bearing his lord's honour as if it were a shield upon his arm. The two men faced each other in the sacred circle, but in truth it was the two Jarls who met there, their fates bound to the outcome. The crowd knew this. They understood that the duel was not just between axe and sword, but between two powers whose rivalry could set the fjords ablaze. If Rolf fell, Svein would lose more than the river valley. He would lose standing among the Jarls of the coast. If Einar died, Hakon's power inland would be shaken, his enemies emboldened. And so the champions carried not only their own lives into the ring, but the balance of power for two great houses. The law had been spoken, the oaths sworn, and now the champions stood ready. The Jarls who had sent them waited in the crowd, their eyes fixed on the circle. The fate of the valley, and perhaps the peace between coast and inland, rested on the clash that was about to begin. For all their blood and spectacle, holmgangs were not always about feeding the hunger for killing. In the hard, law-bound world of the Vikings, they could serve as a pressure valve for tensions that might otherwise tear a region apart. A feud between Jarls, if left unchecked, could draw in dozens of ships and hundreds of warriors. Villages would burn, fields would be trampled, and winter would fall on lands stripped of food and men alike. But a single duel, two champions meeting in the sacred circle, could decide the matter without an army ever leaving its harbour. The wisdom of the holmgang lay in this strange blend of savagery and restraint. The Norse knew that open war was ruinous. It took years to rebuild a burned hall, longer still to replace the lives lost in a raid or a siege. But the warrior culture of the North also knew no peace without satisfaction. A slight unanswered was an open wound. A claim ignored was an insult to one's honour. The duel allowed two sides to meet those needs without unleashing the chaos of full-scale war. Saga after saga speaks of disputes settled in this way. A lord would demand compensation for a slain kinsman. Another would refuse, claiming the killing was justified. A duel would be called Champions Chosen, and the law would set the terms. When the winner stepped from the circle, the losing side could claim they had been given their chance. Honour, if not land or wealth, could be salvaged from the loss. In many cases, that was enough to keep the blood feud from spilling over into open slaughter. One of the best-known examples comes from the tale of Ketil Flatnose, a chieftain of the Western Isles. His ships had clashed with those of a rival over fishing rights in rich coastal waters. Both men had warriors eager for a fight, and both knew that an all-out battle could cripple their fleets for the next season. Instead, they agreed to a holmgang on a narrow beach at low tide. Each chose a champion Ketil's man, a tall axeman named Sturla, and the rival's champion, a swordsman known as Arnkel the Swift. The duel was fierce but short. Arnkel, though quick, could not match the crushing power of Sturla's blows. When the sword fell from his hand, the matter was settled. The fishing rights went to Ketil. The rival lord returned home with his pride bruised but his ships intact, and no more blood was spilled. Such resolutions were not always so neat. There were times when both fighters refused to yield, even after grievous wounds. Sometimes the duel ended in both men dying where they stood, and the law had to puzzle over what to do next. But even then, the damage was contained to 2 lives, not the dozens or hundreds that war would have claimed. The duel was a narrow channel through which the flood of violence could be directed and controlled. The political value of this was immense. Jarls who could resolve disputes by holmgang rather than war gained reputations as prudent leaders, not weak, for they still upheld their claims in combat, but wise enough to spare their people needless ruin. Traders favoured such Jarls, knowing their ports would not be blockaded by long feuds. Farmers trusted them, for their fields were less likely to be seized or burned. Even poets praised them, for a duel offered a clear, contained story to weave into the sagas, rather than the sprawling chaos of war. But there was always risk. If the losing side felt the duel had been unfair, if the champion was accused of using sorcery, if the law speaker was suspected of partiality, if the crowd believed the fight had been decided by trickery rather than skill, the duel could fan the flames of resentment rather than quench them. In such cases, the holmgang became the spark that set the tinder alight. Entire wars have been traced back to a single contested duel, where one man's death was seen as murder in disguise. Yet more often than not, the duel did its work. It allowed men to prove their case with steel, to let fate speak plainly. Those who watched could say they had seen justice done, not whispered behind closed doors, but in the open, before gods and men. It was justice you could touch, justice that bled and fell and lay still upon the ground. On the frost-bitten morning by the bay, this was the hope in the hearts of many who stood watching. They had come not only to see Hrolf and Einar fight, but to see an end to the quarrel between Jarl Svein and Jarl Hakon. If Hrolf's axe struck true, the valley would belong to Svein, and the inland lord would have to swallow his loss. If Einar's sword found its mark, the coast would yield its claim. Either way, the valley would be won or lost without the fjords filling with blood. But in the murmured conversations among the crowd, there was doubt. Both Jarls were proud men. Would the loser truly accept the outcome? Or would the duel, like so many before it, be only the first blow in a longer fight? The answer lay in the circle, in the hands of the two champions who now circled each other like wolves, measuring the moment to strike. If the duel went cleanly, the fjords might know peace that season. If not, the ships would be launched before the next moon, and the sound of oars and war horns would carry over the water. The holmgang could be the last step before peace, or the first step into war. All that remained was to see which it would be. The holmgang was meant to be the sword that cut through the knot of a feud, leaving both sides bound to accept the verdict. Yet in the volatile world of the Vikings, where honor was as sharp as any blade, the duel could just as easily light the fuse of war. If one side doubted the fairness of the fight, or if pride simply could not bend to defeat, the circle became not the end of the quarrel, but the beginning of a greater storm. The most common cause of this failure was the refusal to accept loss. Among proud jarls and fierce warriors, there was no shame in dying well, but to live after losing, with all eyes knowing you had been bested, could be unbearable. Some men could not bring themselves to honor the agreement that had brought them to the circle. They would claim the duel had been corrupted, the victor used forbidden magic, a hidden weapon, or had broken the rules when the witnesses were looking away. Such accusations, even without proof, could poison the peace the holmgang was meant to protect. Other times, the duel itself gave reason for outrage. If a champion struck after his opponent had yielded, if he killed a man who had dropped his weapon, or if he struck outside the agreed bounds of the fight, the victory might be seen as dishonorable. A dishonorable victory was worse than a loss. It turned the winner into a murderer in the eyes of the crowd, and no true peace could be made on the back of such a death. The sagas tell of duels where the loser's kin refused to leave the field, swearing vengeance before the body was cold. One such tale speaks of Brander the Younger, who fought a holmgang over grazing rights against a rival named Ottrig. Brander's blow split Ottrig's helm, felling him instantly. But Otrig's brothers swore they had seen Brander step across the hide's edge in the moment of the killing stroke, an unthinkable breach of the rules. They demanded the duel be declared void. When the witnesses upheld Brander's victory, the brothers answered with steel. Before the day ended, 6 men lay dead on the dueling ground, and the feud raged for 3 bitter years, drawing in both families and their allies. Pride was the kindling, politics was the wind. A duel between champions was never just about 2 men, it was about the jarls and chieftains behind them, the clans whose standing rose or fell with the outcome. If a great lord lost face because his champion fell, he might be pressured by his followers to answer the insult with war. In such cases, the holmgang could feel less like a trial and more like a public provocation. Defeat in the circle was a humiliation laid bare for all to see, and vengeance could become a matter of survival for a leader's authority. There were also times when the holmgang was used as a deliberate trap, its verdict never meant to be honored. A cunning lord might challenge a weaker rival, win the duel through superior skill or the strength of a champion, and then press the advantage, immediately sending raiding ships to seize the very lands he had just claimed. The duel became a pretext for conquest, a thin veil over naked ambition. The loser, seeing the treaty torn to shreds, had no choice but to answer with his own fleet. Thus the duel became the match that lit the fire it had promised to prevent. The danger was greatest when the duel ended in disputed fashion. Imagine 2 champions locked in battle until both were bleeding and staggering, neither willing to yield. One manages a final blow, but is so weakened that he collapses alongside his foe. Who is the victor? If the witnesses cannot agree, if the law speaker hesitates, the circle fills not with clarity but with confusion. In such moments, tempers flared and the fragile peace between factions could shatter in an instant. The ripple of violence from a failed holmgang could spread far beyond the 2 men who fought it. Kinship was the backbone of Norse society, and to allow the death of a kinsman to go unanswered was to invite scorn from friends and contempt from enemies. Even when the duel was lawful, the losing side might feel bound by blood to answer it with steel. Alliances would form around the insult, like storm clouds gathering over the fjord, and soon the quiet valleys would echo with the drumbeat of oars and the roar of war horns. On that frostbound morning by the bay, the risk hung heavy in the air. The crowd had gathered in hope that the clash between Hrolf and Einar would settle the quarrel between Jarl Svein and Jarl Hakon. But there were those in both retinues whose eyes burned with a different fire. Among them were men who whispered that if their champion fell, they would not stand by and see their Jarl shamed. The duel might be the spark they were waiting for, the excuse to launch the ships already prepared in secret coves. And what of the Jarls themselves? Svein was a man of the sea, proud of his ships and the long reach of his influence along the coast. Hakon ruled the valleys and the inland trade, his word law among the hill farms and river crossings. Neither was known for patience. If either one believed the duel's outcome had been stolen by treachery, there would be no peace, only the quick descent into raids, burning halls, and blood spilled in pasture and fjord. The law could speak, the witnesses could swear, but in the end, the duel's power to prevent war depended entirely on the will of those who fought and those who stood behind them. If they accepted the judgment, the holmgang could hold back the tide. If they rejected it, the circle's edge became merely the first boundary crossed in a season of blood. Some say the gods themselves smile on such outcomes, for Odin, lord of battle, is said to take pleasure in war's chaos as much as in the clean finality of a duel. Whether that is true or only a poet's fancy, the reality is clear. In the Viking world, even the most sacred of customs could be bent or broken by pride, ambition, and the thirst for vengeance. On the field by the bay, the duel was about to begin in earnest. But in the hearts of many who watched, the question lingered like the mist over the water: would this be the end of the quarrel, or the beginning of something far worse? In the Viking world, no man stepped into the holmgang alone. He might be flanked only by the law speaker and his own shadow, but in the minds of those watching, unseen powers often walked with him. Some warriors were believed to carry the favor of the gods into the circle-chosen men, whose victories were foretold long before the first blow was struck. Others were whispered to be cursed, doomed to fall no matter their skill. Fate, or word, was as real to the Norse as the wind off the fjord, and in the high-stakes theatre of the duel, its presence was keenly felt. The favor of Odin was the most coveted and the most feared. As the god of war, wisdom, and death, Odin's gifts were double-edged. To be Odin's chosen could mean unmatched cunning in battle, the ability to read an opponent's intentions as if they were runes carved in wood. It could also mean a short, glorious life, for Odin's chosen often died young, carried off to Valhalla in the very prime of their skill. Men claimed Odin's blessing in many ways, through dreams in which the Allfather appeared, through victories so unlikely that they seemed beyond mortal power, or through acts of sheer ferocity that made enemies falter before the fight had even begun. Thor's favor was different. If Odin chose with the eye of a strategist, Thor chose with the arm of a blacksmith. Those believed to be under Thor's protection were men of great strength and endurance, able to shrug off wounds that would cripple another. They fought like the god himself, headlong, unyielding, striking as if each blow were a hammerfall. The crowd looked for signs. A fighter who seemed to grow stronger as the fight wore on, whose anger burned clean and steady rather than wild and wasteful. Such men were said to carry Thor's might in their veins. Some warriors were linked to Frey, god of fertility, prosperity, and kingship. Frey's chosen were thought to carry not only skill but luck, a gift that made them seem charmed. Their weapons found the narrow gap in an enemy's guard. Their feet never tangled in the hide's edge. In the minds of the people, such fortune could not be trained. It was granted. To face such a man in the holmgang was to feel the weight of inevitability pressing against your shield. But the Norse also feared those who bore the shadow of Hel, goddess of the dead. These were men who had lost too much or lived too long under ill-omened signs. They might be skilled, even deadly, but there was a pall over them that seemed to drain the strength of their allies and feed the courage of their foes. To fight such a man was to battle someone already half in the grave, dangerous, yet somehow already defeated. Berserkers were perhaps the most visible example of divine, or at least supernatural favor. To some, they were Odin's own wolves and bears, sent to sow terror and carnage. To others, they were men so consumed by fury and ritual that they stepped beyond the boundaries of mortal limitation. In the holmgang, a berserker could be a nightmare. eyes glazed, body trembling with a dangerous energy, blows raining down without pause. Witnesses swore such men did not feel pain, that even when blood ran from their wounds, they pressed on as if nothing had touched them. Whether this was truly the work of the gods, or the product of battle drugs and frenzied, did not matter to those who faced them. The effect was the same dread. It was not only the fighters themselves who believed in such favor. The crowd did too, and their belief could shape the fight before it began. A man thought to be Odin's chosen might see his opponent already half-beaten in spirit, wary of every feint, convinced that some hidden trick was waiting to strike him down. The same belief could fill the chosen man with confidence, his mind alight with the certainty that victory was already written in the threads of fate. This belief in divine favor tied closely to the Norse sense of word. Fate was not seen as a straight path, but as a web, and the gods could tug at its strands. A man might strive all his life, but if the Norns had spun his death into this day, nothing could unmake it. For this reason, some warriors stepped into the holmgang without fear. They believed the hour of their death was already set. If it was not today, no sword could find their heart. If it was, then better to meet it in the circle, weapon in hand, than cowering in the shadows. There were stories told in the firelight of Duels where divine favor seemed plain. A young champion who had never fought a holmgang before, facing a veteran twice his age, somehow struck the killing blow in the first exchange. A wounded man, staggering and barely able to hold his shield, suddenly found the strength to surge forward and end the fight in a single, perfect stroke. A fighter whose weapon shattered mid-battle, yet who seized his opponent's own sword and turned it against him in the space of a heartbeat. Such moments lived on in saga because they hinted at something beyond human skill, the hand of the gods themselves. Yet divine favor was fickle. A man blessed in one fight could find the gods silent in the next. Some said this was because the gods loved a contest, not a champion. They would lift one man high only to cast him down later, just to see what he would do. Others believed that favor was a test, to see if a man would honor it with humility or squander it in arrogance. The gods were not bound to their chosen. In the Norse mind, they were as free and unpredictable as the sea. On that morning by the bay, there were whispers in the crowd about Hrolf and Einar. Some claimed Hrolf was under Odin's gaze, that ravens had been seen circling his ship when it came into harbor. Others said Einar bore Thor's strength, pointing to his towering frame and the way his muscles bunched like coiled ropes beneath his mail. Both men had the bearing of warriors who carried something beyond themselves into the circle. Whether it was truly the favor of the gods or only the deep well of their own belief, none could say. But in the Viking world, the difference hardly mattered. Belief itself was a weapon. If you could make your opponent doubt his own fate and fear yours, you had already taken the first step toward victory. And as the champions closed the distance between them, the murmur of the crowd was thick with the weight of unseen powers, gods, fate, and the long, cold hand of destiny reaching toward the circle. If the sight of an armed man stepping into the holmgang circle was enough to stir the blood of the crowd, then the arrival of a berserker was something else entirely. It was a shift in the air itself, a tightening of the chest, as if the earth understood that something dangerous had been loosed upon it. These men were not merely warriors, they were storms wrapped in human skin. The word berserker is old, with roots tangled in the mists of Norse legend. Some say it comes from berserker, bear shirt, for the great shaggy pelts they sometimes wore into battle. Others claim it meant bare shirt, because they fought without mail, trusting neither in iron nor leather but only in their own fury. Whatever the truth, the image was the same, a fighter who stood apart from other men, whose rage was a weapon as sharp as his blade. Berserkers were feared for their berserksganga, the battle trance that could transform them into something more beast than man. Eyewitnesses claimed they shook and snarled like wolves, bit the rims of their shields until the wood splintered, and roared with a sound that seemed to belong to no human throat. Their eyes were said to roll white, their skin flush red or pale as ash, and their strength to swell beyond mortal measure. They would charge through the clash of weapons without flinching, heedless of wounds that would have stopped another fighter cold. The sources disagree on what brought on this fury. Some believed it was the gift of Odin himself, for the Allfather was said to favor warriors who gave themselves wholly to the chaos of battle. Others whispered of darker arts, rituals, charms, and secret draughts brewed from herbs and mushrooms that could stir the mind into madness. A few claimed it was simply a state of mind, a surrender so complete to violence that the body became deaf to pain and blind to fear. Whatever the cause, The effect was terrifying. In the holmgang circle, where every step and strike mattered, a berserker's presence could tilt the fight before it began. The sheer unpredictability of their movements made them hard to read. They might rush forward in a frenzy, hammering at an opponent's shield until it shattered in their hands. Or they could stand motionless for long moments, glaring with a predator's stillness before lunging in a sudden, explosive attack. Facing such a man was like trying to fight fire. One wrong move, one moment's hesitation, and you were burned. The sagas preserve tales of berserkers in the holmgang that have the feel of nightmare. One speaks of Hauk the Raven-Eyed, who fought 3 men in 3 duels over a single day, killing each in turn without taking more than a scratch. His opponents swore they had struck him. One claimed to have felt his sword bite deep into Hauk's ribs, but the berserker fought on, grinning through the blood that poured from his side, until the fight was his. Only when the 3rd man lay dead did Hauk stumble and fall, his life spilling out across the hide. The law made no special rules for berserkers. They were bound by the same boundaries, the same oaths, the same witnesses. But everyone knew the truth that the law might struggle to contain them once the berserksganga took hold. There were cases where a berserker, having slain his opponent, turned on the nearest spectator before he could be restrained. It was one reason some communities began to restrict or even ban the holmgang altogether in later years. The duel was meant to be a channel for violence, not a floodgate thrown open. Fighting a berserker in the holmgang was a test of nerve as much as of skill. An opponent who met fury with fury risked being swept away in the tide. Those who survived often did so by fighting with cold calculation, letting the berserker exhaust himself in the first wild rush before striking. Shields and footwork were vital. The key was to deny the berserker the close, crushing fight he craved. But this was easier said than done. The hide's narrow bounds meant there was nowhere to run, no way to bleed away the storm at a safe distance. You had to weather it where you stood. To the crowd, the arrival of a berserker in the duel circle was both dread and spectacle. People spoke of it for years afterward. Children would imitate the roars and stomps in play. Men would argue in the hall over whether the berserker's rage was divine or demonic. And poets would weave the story into verse. There was a fascination in watching a man step so completely out of himself, into something raw and ancient. On that morning by the bay, no one would have called Hrolf Ketilsson a berserker, but there were whispers that he had fought beside them, that he knew their ways. Einar of Crossfjord, though not given to madness, had faced berserkers before and lived to tell of it. Both men understood the power of such fury, and both knew how dangerous it would be if it erupted in the holmgang circle. If either of them had been a true berserker, the duel's tone would have been very different, faster, wilder, more unpredictable. Even so, the spirit of the berserker hung over every duel. The crowd half hoped to see it burst forth, for nothing in the Viking world so perfectly embodied the raw truth of combat. In the berserker, the line between man and god, between human and beast, blurred until it vanished. And in the narrow circle of the holmgang, that blur could decide the fate of men, jarls, and even entire valleys. Though the holmgang was a stage dominated by men, the sagas and scattered historical accounts whisper of a rarer, more startling sight, a woman stepping into the duel circle. When it happened, the air around the hide seemed to change, for such moments defied not only expectation but the rigid boundaries of law and gender that framed Viking life. Yet in the Norse world, where honor was the lifeblood of both men and women, there were times when a woman's honor could only be defended by her own hand. The Viking woman was not the cloistered figure of later medieval Europe. She ruled her household with authority, managed farms and trade when her husband was away, and could command servants and thralls with a word. The law recognized her right to hold property, to divorce an unworthy husband, and to demand compensation for wrongs done to her or her kin. But these rights were protected by the same cultural code that governed men, the drengskaper, the ideal of honorable conduct. If that code was broken in a way that demanded steel, there were women willing to take it up. Shield maidens, those semi-legendary warrior women of saga fame, are the most famous examples. Whether they were a distinct class of fighters or simply extraordinary individuals is debated, but their presence in the old stories is undeniable. They are often described as taking part in raids and battles, standing in the shield wall alongside men. In the holmgang, their role was even more striking. Here was no chaos of the battlefield, no anonymity in the clash of armies. The duel circle exposed the fighter completely, every movement, every decision, every triumph or failure watched by all. One saga tells of Herva, the daughter of a slain chieftain, who demanded her inheritance from an uncle who sought to cheat her of it. When he refused, she challenged him to holmgang. The duel was fierce, Herva wielding a sword said to have been her father's, her uncle armed with axe and shield. She fought with such ferocity that the crowd murmured she must have been favored by Odin himself. In the end, she forced him to yield, securing both her claim and her reputation as a woman who could not be bent. These were not acts taken lightly. For a woman to step into the holmgang was to invite a level of scrutiny that could lift her to near-mythic fame or cast her into ruin. If she won, she might be spoken of in every hall from the fjords to the Thingvellir plains. Her victory would be used to warn men that even those they thought weak could be deadly if wronged. But if she lost, the shame was magnified for her, and for her kin because the challenge itself had been so bold. In some cases, women fought in defense of others rather than themselves. A mother might take up arms for the honor of a slain son, a sister for a brother whose death demanded vengeance. Such acts were steeped in the deepest strands of Norse loyalty, for kinship bound the living and the dead alike. To stand for a fallen relative in the holmgang was to weave their memory into the act of justice, to declare that the blood spilled once would not be dishonored by passivity. There are also darker tales, where women were forced into the holmgang against their will, usually as part of cruel wagers or in the settling of twisted disputes. These rare accounts paint a grim picture: women dragged into the circle to defend themselves without training or preparation, often as a way for their enemies to strip them of honor by orchestrating their defeat. Such cases, though condemned in the law, remind us that the holmgang could be misused as a tool of humiliation as well as of justice. The law itself did not forbid women from fighting, but neither did it explicitly encourage it. This ambiguity meant that each case depended on the will of the community and the standing of the woman involved. A woman of high birth, respected for her wisdom or courage, might find the thing willing to permit her challenge. A thrall or servant woman, even if grievously wronged, would rarely be granted the same chance. In this way, the duel circle reflected the same hierarchies that shaped the broader Viking world. When a woman did fight, the scene was unforgettable. She would often wear the same garb as any warrior: tunic, trousers, sometimes mail if she could afford it. A shield might bear her family's mark, a weapon passed down from father or brother. The crowd would press closer, craning to see whether she moved with the surety of one trained in arms or with the raw determination of a novice. In either case, the stakes were the same: victory or defeat, honor or disgrace. There is a tale from the Orkneyinga saga of Ragnhild, daughter of a Norse earl, who fought a holmgang to defend her right to a coastal holding. Her opponent, a seasoned fighter, mocked her before the fight, calling her maid as if it were an insult. But in the circle, Ragnhild proved the sharper tongue was not the sharper blade. She struck him in the leg early, hampering his movement, and pressed her advantage until he stumbled and yielded. In that moment, the crowd saw not a woman defeating a man, but a rightful claimant defeating a usurper. The rare presence of women in the holmgang added a layer of complexity to the Viking idea of honor. It proved that the code was not bound entirely by gender, that courage, skill, and the willingness to face death in the circle could be respected in anyone who possessed them. But it also highlighted the limits of that respect, for even victorious women often found their deeds remembered more as curiosities than as precedents. On the frost-covered field by the bay, no woman stood among the champions that day. Yet those who knew the sagas might have thought of Herva or Ragnhild, of the few but fierce women who had stepped into the circle and proved that steel in the hand could weigh as heavily as steel in the heart. In the world of the Vikings, the holmgang belonged to those willing to claim it, and on rare, unforgettable days, that included women whose names would echo long after the snow had melted from the dueling ground. In the Viking world, every drop of blood had a value, and in the holmgang, that value was made starkly clear. This was not a brawl for pride alone. The duel was a wager where the stake was everything a man could claim: his honor, his wealth, his family's standing, even his life. To win was to seize those stakes. To lose was to see them stripped away, leaving nothing but shame and the echo of the crowd's judgment. The Norse called it blóðgjald, the blood price, and it could take many forms. Sometimes it was a tangible reward, land whose ownership had been disputed, the right to graze cattle in rich meadows, or a hoard of silver hidden in a locked chest. In other cases, the prize was a right, the authority to lead a ship, to claim a marriage, to hold a title within the thing. But behind all these lay the greater, invisible prize, the preservation of honor. In the Norse mind, honor was not a soft thing of words and courtesies. It was the hard coin that bought a man his place in the world. Without it, wealth meant nothing. With it, even a poor man could command respect. Honor determined whether others would stand beside you in battle, whether a chieftain would give you a place at his fire, whether your children would inherit your good name or carry the stain of disgrace. The holmgang was one of the most public measures of that honor. Win, and your standing rose. Lose, and it fell like a stone into the sea. The law recognized this with brutal clarity. If the duel had been fought for land, the victor took possession immediately, with witnesses to swear the claim was now his. If the fight was over silver or goods, they were delivered before the assembly dispersed. If the holmgang had been fought for a marriage, claim rare, but not unheard of, the woman and her dowry were handed over as if they were a rightful part of the spoils. In some cases, the duel was fought over the right to lead a trading voyage or control a ship, meaning the winner walked away with command over men and cargo alike. For the loser, the costs were steep. Death, of course, was the ultimate price, and it was far from rare. Many holmgangs were fought to the finish, and in such duels, there was no blood price to pay afterward. The dead man had paid it in full with his life. But even when a fighter survived by yielding or being wounded into submission, he did not walk away free. His claim was forfeit. Any property or rights at stake were surrendered immediately. If he had challenged unjustly, he might owe wergild manprice to his opponent for the insult of forcing the fight. Wergild was a deeply ingrained part of Norse justice. It was the set value placed on a person's life, varying by social rank. For a common free man, it might be measured in dozens of silver marks. For a chieftain, in many times that amount. In the holmgang, wergild could be demanded if the loser's challenge was deemed wrongful or malicious. In such cases, the loss was double the humiliation of defeat and the draining of wealth. Defeat carried other penalties that the law did not write down but society enforced. A man who yielded in the circle might find his allies less willing to answer his call to arms. A trader might be offered poorer terms, for who would trust a man who could not hold his own ground? At feasts, his place might be moved further from the high table, his voice given less weight in the thing. Such wounds were slow to heal, if they healed at all. In some sagas, the blood price is as much about legacy as it is about the moment. The children of a man who fell in the holmgang often bore the shadow of his defeat. They might have to fight harder to win honor of their own, or even to hold the property their father had once claimed. Conversely, the children of a victor inherited not just his land but the story of his triumph. That story could serve them for years, opening doors and earning allies before they ever took up a sword themselves. The blood price could also be deeply personal. For a man fighting in the name of his kin, losing meant failing them, leaving a sister unwed, a son without an inheritance, a family's claim gone to a rival. In such cases, the holmgang was more than a legal trial. It was a moment where a man's entire worth as protector and provider was measured in the arc of his blade. No amount of silver could balance the shame of failing in such a duty. The harshness of the blood price was part of what gave the holmgang its power. Everyone in the crowd understood what was at stake. They could see the land in question, imagine the silver counted out, picture the marriage or title about to be won or lost. They could feel the tension of knowing that in a few moments, one man's life would change utterly, while the others would crumble. The duel was more than violence. It was transformation, instant and irrevocable. On the frostlit morning by the bay, this truth hung heavy in the cold air. For Hrolf Ketilsson, victory would mean securing the fertile river valley for his Jarl. Jarl Svein, a prize that would feed men and cattle for generations, and strengthen Svein's power along the coast. For Einar of Crossfjord, it meant preserving the valley for his own lord, Jarl Hakon, keeping the inland trade secure and the coastal jarls in check. The blood price, for both, was the fate of an entire stretch of land, and with it, the balance of power in the region. Both champions knew that defeat meant more than personal loss. It meant seeing their jarl diminished, their people weakened, and their own names etched into the sagas not as victors but as the men who failed when the fate of many rested on their shoulders. The crowd knew it too. and they watched with the taut silence of those who understood that the duel's verdict would echo far beyond the hide pegged to the frozen ground. The sagas of the Norse are filled with duels not just as isolated moments of violence, but as turning points in the lives of men and women, the kind that shape the course of entire families and kingdoms. These tales, passed down through generations, made the holmgang more than a legal trial or a bloody spectacle. They turned it into a stage for the timeless drama of honor, vengeance, and fate. In their telling, every strike of a sword carried the weight of destiny. Among the most celebrated duelists is Egil Skallagrimsson, the poet-warrior whose life was a chain of feuds, voyages, and battles. In Egil's saga, we hear of how, as a young man, he fought and killed Ljot the Pale in a holmgang. Ljot was older, stronger, and already renowned as a fighter, but Egil, fierce even in youth, pressed the fight without fear. The duel ended when Egil split Ljot's head with a single tremendous blow, a moment that established him not only as a warrior of deadly skill but as a man whose fate would be written in blood and verse. That duel was not a private affair. It was a declaration, carried on the lips of men across Iceland and Norway, that Egil was to be reckoned with. Another tale, from Njal's saga, tells of Gunnar Hammundason, perhaps the most admired fighter in all the sagas. Gunnar was unmatched with spear and bow, but in the holmgang he wielded sword and shield with such mastery that no man could best him in single combat. His most famous duel came not on the open field but on a riverbank, against a man who had challenged him over an insult at the Thing. Gunnar fought with a grace that made the clash seem like a deadly dance, turning aside blow after blow until his opponent's guard faltered. In a final swift movement, Gunnar struck him down, then stepped back without delivering the killing stroke. This act of mercy, rare in such fights, only deepened his fame. The sagas remember Gunnar as the man who could win any fight but who also knew when to let a man live. There are duels in the sagas that stand out not for the skill of the fighters, but for the stakes they carried. In Grettir's saga, the outlaw hero Grettir Asmundarson faced a man named Skeggi in a holmgang to settle a dispute over rightful ownership of land. Skeggi was a fearsome opponent, a man built like an oak tree, and the fight was brutal from the first moment. They hacked each other's shields to splinters, their weapons ringing in the air like the tolling of iron bells. In the end, Grettir's endurance carried him through. He struck Skeggi a crushing blow to the head that ended the duel. That victory gave Grettir the land, but it also stoked enmity that would follow him for the rest of his days, proving that even in victory, the holmgang could sow the seeds of future trouble. The sagas also remember duels fought for love. One such tale is that of Kari Selmundarson, who fought for the right to marry the woman he loved after a rival suitor claimed her hand through family alliance. Kari's opponent was skilled, and the fight was fierce, but Kari's determination drove him to press the attack again and again. The duel ended with his rival disarmed and sprawled on the ground. With the victory came marriage, but also a lifetime of enmity from the defeated man's kin. Love won by the sword carried its own dangers. Not all duels in the sagas were noble affairs. Some were marked by treachery, and the bards recorded them as warnings. In the saga of the people of Vatsdal, a fighter named Ingemund faced a rival in holmgang who, unbeknownst to the witnesses, had smuggled a second blade into the fight. When his shield was shattered, and he seemed on the brink of defeat, the man drew the hidden weapon and struck Ingemund down. Though he claimed victory, the witnesses called foul, and the law declared the duel void. But Ingemund was dead, and his kin swore vengeance. That treacherous duel led to a chain of killings that no law could contain. Even the way these duels were remembered mattered. A victory in the holmgang could be recounted in feasts and in the halls of kings, earning the fighter silver, gifts, or even a place in the warband of a great jarl. Poets wove the stories into verse, and in a culture where memory was as precious as gold, such verses were a kind of immortality. A man's deeds in the duel circle could be sung long after his bones had turned to dust. Yet the sagas also remind us that fame was a double-edged sword. A man renowned for his victories would draw challengers eager to test themselves against him. The holmgang could lift a man to greatness, but it could also mark him for an early grave. The duel circle was not a place one could visit too often, without tempting fate. On that frozen morning by the bay, the crowd would have known these stories. They would have seen Rolf Ketilsson and Einar of Crossfjord not just as men, but as potential figures of saga names to be carried forward in the telling. Their fight would join the long line of duels remembered not merely for the clash of steel, but for the weight they carried in the lives and fortunes of those involved. For in the Viking world, a famous duel was never just about who walked away alive. It was about what that survival meant for families, for jarls, for the fragile web of alliances that held the North together. And when the holmgang was done, and the victor's name began to travel on the tongues of poets and traders, it would either bind the land closer in peace, or split it further into blood. The holmgang was often remembered for its brute strength, the crushing power of an axe blow, the ringing clash of sword on shield, but those who had fought many duels knew that strength alone was rarely enough. In the tight confines of the duel circle, cunning could be as deadly as any weapon. The fighters who survived again and again were not always the strongest or fastest, but those who knew how to shape the fight, how to turn an opponent's mind against him before the killing blow was struck. Deception in the holmgang did not mean dishonor, at least, not when it followed the rules. The duel was a contest of skill, and skill included the ability to read and mislead. Feints, false retreats, hidden preparations, these were as much a part of the art as the sharpened edge of the blade. The crowd expected to see them, and a clever ruse that brought a clean victory could earn as much admiration as sheer force. One of the most common tricks was the feint, a blow aimed not to land but to draw a reaction. A swordsman might drop his shoulder and begin a downward cut toward his opponent's shield arm, knowing the enemy would shift his guard to meet it. In the same heartbeat, the sword would change course, darting toward the exposed thigh or neck. The danger of the feint was that it demanded speed and precision. If the opponent did not take the bait, the attacker could find himself open in turn. Another favored tactic was the false retreat. In the narrow holmgang, there was little room to move, but a fighter could still give ground deliberately, letting his enemy press forward too quickly. An over-eager opponent might step too close, crossing the subtle rhythm of the fight. In that instant, the defender could spring forward, striking, while the attacker's weight was still shifting. This tactic was especially deadly against opponents whose style relied on constant aggression, for it turned their momentum into a weapon against them. Shield work also offered opportunities for deception. A fighter could deliberately lower his shield just enough to invite a high attack, then snap it up at the last moment, catching the blow and twisting it aside to open the attacker's guard. Some duelists even used the shield as a weapon in its own right, smashing the rim into a foe's jaw or shoulder to stun him before delivering the finishing strike. Such moves were risky. The moment the shield left its guarding position, the fighter was vulnerable, but in the right hands, they could decide the fight in a heartbeat. There were also subtler preparations made before the duel even began. Some men studied their opponents at the thing or in past fights, noting how they held their weapons, which foot they led with, whether they favored attack or defense. They might choose a weapon or style specifically to exploit these habits. If a man was known to rely heavily on his shield, an axe could be used to hook and drag it away. If he favored long thrusts with a spear, a shield-heavy, close-range style could rob him of his reach. Occasionally, fighters would disguise the true condition of their weapons. A sword nicked or dulled in earlier fighting might be polished until it gleamed, hiding its weakness from an opponent until the moment of strain. Some duelists even altered the weight of their shields or the balance of their axes to throw off the expectations of an enemy who thought he knew their style. All of this was within the spirit of the holmgang, so long as no forbidden magic or concealed weapons were used. But not all deceptions were without controversy. There were those who skirted the edge of the law, fighters who coated their blades with grease to make wounds bleed more freely, or who wore extra padding under their tunics to dull the force of blows. Such acts, if discovered, could see a victory overturned and the offender named a cheat. The duel was sacred to the law, and while guile was welcome, outright trickery that broke the agreed rules could stain a man's honor forever. Some fighters became famous for their cunning above all else. The saga of Cormac tells of one duel where he faced a much larger opponent whose shield was nearly as tall as a man. Cormac feigned weakness, circling slowly as if afraid to close the distance. When his opponent lunged, Cormac stepped to the side and used the bearded edge of his axe to hook the top of the shield. With a sharp jerk, he dragged the shield down and forward, pulling his enemy off balance. In the same motion, Cormac's sword flashed in, ending the fight with a clean stroke to the unguarded shoulder. To the crowd, moments like these were pure theatre. They watched for the sudden shifts in tempo, the trap sprung in an instant, the gasp that ran through the onlookers when a fight turned on a single clever move. A duel decided by wit as much as steel was a reminder that the holmgang was not just a test of muscle but of mind. On the frost-hardened ground by the bay, Both Rolf Ketilsson and Einar of Crossfjord were fighters of long experience. Neither was likely to be lured into a crude trick, but each knew that a well-timed feint or a deceptive shift in stance could be the key to victory. Their eyes never left each other as they circled, reading every twitch of a hand, every shift of weight, every tightening of a grip. In the duel circle, such details were life and death. The holmgang was a place where strength and cunning met, each as dangerous as the other. A heavy blow could crush a man, but so could a mistake drawn from him by a clever ruse. The masters of the duel were those who could wield both to strike with the power of the bear and the guile of the fox. And as the champions closed in, each step and glance was another move in the silent chess game that would decide which of them would leave the circle alive. To the Vikings, the holmgang was not fought in the circle alone. Though the hide was pegged to the frozen earth, its edges drawn with law and custom, many believed there were other forces at play, unseen hands, that could tilt the balance between victory and death. In the Norse world, magic and the supernatural were as real as the steel in a warrior's hand, and in the high stakes of the holmgang, these forces were both feared and courted. The most feared accusation in the duel was the use of seether, the old magic, practiced most often by women known as valur, but not unknown among men. Seether was the art of shaping fate itself, foretelling the future, weaving illusions, or bending the will of others. In the holmgang, a fighter accused of using such magic risked more than his life. He risked his honor, for to twist the outcome with sorcery was to betray the duel's sacred purpose. Yet the suspicion was always there. If a man fought with uncanny foresight, if he seemed to read every move before it happened, some would whisper that he had called on the Norns themselves to guide his hand. There was also Galdr, the magic of spoken charms. Warriors might carve runes into their sword hilts or whisper incantations under their breath before the fight began. Some runes were meant to steady the hand, others to sap the strength of an enemy. The sagas tell of Egil Skallagrimsson carving runes into a drinking horn to detect poison, but runes could also be cut into weapons or shields for protection in battle. In the holmgang, such markings could unsettle an opponent, whether or not they truly held power. Belief, after all, was its own kind of magic. The line between the supernatural and the purely psychological was blurred. Some fighters entered the duel with talismans, an amulet carved from bone, a pendant of Thor's hammer, a scrap of cloth said to be from the cloak of a victorious ancestor. These objects might have no physical effect, yet their presence steadied the mind, lending the bearer the confidence that he fought with more than mortal aid. Against an enemy who feared the gods' intervention, such tokens could weigh heavily indeed. The berserkers, too, were linked to the supernatural. Many believed their berserksgangra, their battle fury, was a form of possession that they were ridden by Odin's spirit wolves, or by the bear spirits whose skins they wore. In the holmgang, facing such a man was to face not just a human opponent, but a vessel for some primal force. Even those who scoffed at magic might feel their resolve shake under the weight of that belief. Dreams and omens were not ignored in the days before a duel. A man who dreamed of his death the night before might enter the circle already half defeated in spirit. Likewise, a dream of victory could give a fighter the dangerous assurance that the gods had promised him the win. Ravens circling overhead, a sudden break in the clouds, the call of a lone wolf in the early morning, any of these could be read as a sign from the unseen world. Some fighters went so far as to delay or refuse a duel if the omens were bad, though this risked being branded a coward. Then there was the darker magic, Nith, the curse. To carve or speak Nith against a man was to stain his honor, to call him unmanly or dishonorable in the eyes of the community. It was more than insult, it was a form of magical defamation. In the holmgang, to accuse your opponent of being under Nith could work like a blade against the spirit, undermining his standing before the first blow was struck. The duel would then become as much about erasing that stain as about the legal claim at hand. Some sagas speak of duels where magic was suspected but never proven. In one tale, a fighter named Arngrim carried a sword he claimed was forged by dwarves, its edge able to cut through mail as if it were linen. He won every duel he fought, until one day a rival shattered the sword with a single blow. The crowd muttered that the dwarf's favour had abandoned him, and without it, he was slain within moments. Whether the blade had truly been enchanted, or whether Arngrim's skill had simply faltered without it, no one could say, but the belief in its power had shaped his legend. Even when magic was not invoked openly, The holmgang carried a sense of ritual that blurred the line between combat and ceremony. The act of stepping into the circle, of swearing oaths before witnesses, of crossing weapons in a set space under agreed rules, all this had the structure of a rite. It was a performance for the gods as much as for the crowd. In such a setting, the idea that unseen forces might join the contest was natural. On that frostbound morning by the bay, some in the crowd might have wondered what charms or omens Hrolf Ketilsson and Einar of Crossfjord carried with them. Had they carved runes into the haft of their weapons? Had they sought blessings from a Velva or whispered prayers to Odin in the quiet hours before dawn? Did either believe the gods had chosen him, or that some ill shadow hung over his foe? No one could know for certain, and that uncertainty was part of the duel's power. For in the Viking world, magic was not a separate realm from life. It was woven into the daily struggle for survival, the reading of the sky and sea, the shaping of wood and steel. In the holmgang, where every edge mattered, the supernatural was another weapon, invisible, unpredictable, and, to those who believed, as sharp as any sword. No holmgang was fought in isolation. Even though the duel was meant to be a personal trial between two warriors, it was always framed by the eyes of those who came to witness it. The crowd was more than an audience. It was the living memory of the fight, the judge of its fairness, the echo chamber, where the victor's fame or the loser's disgrace would be amplified for years to come. The first to arrive at the site of a holmgang were often the supporters of each fighter kinsman, friends, shipmates, and allies. They came armed not to join the fight, but to guard its honor, ensuring no one interfered. In the Viking world, the duel's sanctity was paramount, and both sides would have men watching closely for any breach of the rules. These supporters stood just outside the marked ground, close enough to see every movement, their hands resting on sword hilts, their faces unreadable. Beyond them gathered the rest of the crowd, farmers from nearby fields, traders from the market, wandering warriors eager to see a test of skill. Women came as well, some in support of the fighters, others drawn by the spectacle or the chance to see justice done in the open. Children clung to their mothers' cloaks, wide-eyed as they watched the preparations, absorbing the ritual and the tension as part of their education in the ways of honor. The presence of the crowd changed the fight. No matter how seasoned a warrior, he knew that every move, every choice, was being weighed by dozens, perhaps hundreds, of eyes. The duel was not only about defeating the opponent, it was about doing so in a way that would be remembered well. A sloppy victory could tarnish a man's name almost as much as defeat. A clean, decisive win or a display of courage in the face of inevitable loss could burnish his reputation for a lifetime. The witnesses held a special role. Appointed at the challenge's acceptance, they stood as the duel's official record keepers. Their word would carry weight at the thing, if any dispute arose afterward. If one man claimed the other had broken the rules, it was the witnesses who would decide. Their eyes were the law's eyes, and their memory of the duel would be treated as fact. For this reason, witnesses were chosen for their integrity, often older men respected by both sides. The reactions of the crowd could sway the duel in subtle ways. A cheer for a well-placed blow could strengthen the arm of the man who struck it, while murmurs of disapproval might erode his confidence. Some fighters thrived on the roar of the onlookers, feeding on it like fuel. Others shut it out, retreating into a tunnel of focus, where the crowd became nothing more than a shifting blur beyond the edge of the circle. But the crowd was not always passive. In some sagas, spectators intervened when they felt the duel was turning unjust. If a fighter was struck after yielding, supporters might rush the victor to defend the fallen man's honor. In rare and bloody cases, a duel's end sparked open fighting between the two camps of onlookers. The line between audience and participant could vanish in an instant if tempers flared. The audience also carried the duel's outcome back into the world. Their telling of the fight would shape its legacy. A victory witnessed by many would spread quickly, carried by traders along the coast and by farmers to distant valleys. Even those who had not seen it would hear the details repeated and embroidered until the duel took on a life of its own. A man's fame might be made as much by the storytellers in the crowd as by his own blade. In this way, the crowd became a second battlefield, one of reputation and memory. A fighter who carried himself with poise, who fought bravely and honorably even in defeat, could win admiration that might soften the sting of loss. Likewise, a victor who fought cruelly or broke the duel's spirit could find his victory soured in the mouths of those who told the tale. The fight was short, but its telling could last generations, and the crowd was the first link in that chain. The law speaker, too, was part of this audience, though set apart by duty. His voice framed the duel from the beginning, calling for silence, reciting the terms, and giving the signal to begin. During the fight, he watched closely, ready to declare its end if the rules were broken or if one fighter yielded. His authority gave weight to the verdict, but his presence also reminded the crowd and the fighters that this was no street brawl. This was law in motion, visible to all. On that frost-hardened morning by the bay, the crowd stood thick around the holmgang circle. Hrolf Kettleson's supporters gathered on one side, their cloaks dark against the snow, eyes fixed on their champion. Across from them, Einar of Crossfjord's men stood with arms folded, the cold mist rising from their breath like dragon smoke. Between them, a shifting sea of locals, traders, and curious onlookers pressed in, their voices low, their faces taut with anticipation. Every cough, every crunch of a boot on the frozen ground, every murmur between neighbours carried into the charged air of the duel circle. Somewhere a child asked a question and was hushed. Somewhere else, a woman clasped her hands and whispered a prayer to Thor. The law speaker's voice cut through it all, measured and calm. But beneath his words, the heartbeat of the crowd throbbed the collective awareness that they were about to witness something that would be spoken of long after the winter ice had melted from the bay. For in the Viking world, the duel was never just between two men. It was between two men and the judgment of everyone who watched. And when the last blow fell, when one fighter stepped from the circle and the other lay still, the crowd's verdict given in whispers, in cheers, in the stories they carried away, would be as enduring as the verdict of the law. Though most holmgangs were fought on solid ground in meadows, on riverbanks, or at the Thingstead, there were times when the duel circle was drawn not on earth at all, but upon the unsteady back of the sea. These were the sea duels, rare but unforgettable, when two warriors chose to meet upon a ship's deck or on a bare rock rising from the waves, surrounded by the cold and endless water. In the earliest days of the tradition, the very word holmgang meant going to the islet, for many duels were fought on small islands where neither fighter could retreat without plunging into the sea. As the custom spread inland, the islet became symbolic, a patch of ground marked by a hide or rope, but in the fjords and archipelagos, the original form survived. Here, the duel truly was a fight on an island, sometimes no more than a slab of stone barely large enough for the fighters to stand apart. The sea itself became the boundary. To step outside the circle was to fall into water colder than death. Some duels were fought aboard ships. The deck of a longship offered a space narrow and treacherous, the planks slick with spray, the air full of the groan of wood and the slap of waves against the hull. The mast might be the central marker, the duelists circling it like wolves in a pen. The railings were the boundary. Lean too far and a sudden lurch could send a man tumbling into the sea. In such fights, balance and footwork were as important as skill with the blade. A man could be the better fighter and still lose if a roll of the ship pitched him into the water. The sea duel brought its own kind of tension. On land, the crowd could press close, their voices swelling and falling with the rhythm of the fight. At sea, the audience was often smaller, the crew of the ship, perhaps a second vessel tied alongside to carry witnesses. Their shouts were whipped away by the wind, the salt tang sharp in the nose, the taste of brine on every breath. The sound of steel was joined by the groan of rigging, the rush of water, and the hollow boom of waves beneath the hull. One saga tells of a sea duel between two captains, each accusing the other of treachery in trade. They agreed to settle the matter on the deck of a single ship, moored in the calm of a sheltered fjord. Both wore mail, both bore swords, and both had fought in many lands. But the deck was slick from a passing rain, and early in the fight one slipped, catching himself only by the rim of the ship. His opponent closed in, pressing him against the rail. The duel might have ended there, but the ship rolled slightly, throwing both off balance. In the chaos, the man who had been on the defensive struck a desperate blow that split his enemy's helm. Victory, in this case, was as much a gift of the sea as of the sword. On the small rocky skerries that dotted the coasts of Norway and Iceland, duels were even more perilous. These fights took place on slabs of stone barely wider than a farmstead's table. The fighters might be surrounded by the churning surf, the spray leaping high enough to dampen their cloaks. The footing was uneven, the rocks slick with seaweed, and every step risked a slip that could end the duel in an instant. The waves below were not merely cold, they were deadly, pulling the fallen down into the dark with an icy grip that no man could break. The sagas speak of such duels with awe. One famous account tells of Bjorn the broad-shouldered and Styrkar the red, who fought on a skerry so small that their shields nearly touched at the start. They circled warily, each knowing that one wrong step could hurl him into the surf. The fight was short but furious, ending when Bjorn hooked Styrkar's ankle with the rim of his shield, sending him sprawling backward into the sea. Bjorn claimed the victory, though Styrkar's kin would forever call it a trick rather than a true defeat. Sea duels were not only about combat, they were tests of nerve. Even the most seasoned warrior could feel his balance betray him on a pitching deck or a slick stone. The knowledge that the cold water waited only a step away pressed on the mind as heavily as the threat of the opponent's blade. A duel on land could be planned, measured. At sea, the fight was shared with the unpredictable will of the waves. To the Vikings, the sea was no stranger. It was their road, their larder, their battlefield. But to face it in the holmgang was to face two enemies at once. A man could fight the greatest duel of his life and still be claimed by the water if luck turned against him. The sea had no care for honor or law. It took the victor and the vanquished alike. On that cold morning by the bay, with frost rhyming the timbers of the moored ships, the thought of such duels might have been in the minds of those watching. They knew the sea's double nature, friend and foe, giver of riches and thief of lives. Though Hrolf Ketilsson and Einar of Crossfjord would fight on land that day, both had spent their lives with salt in their blood. They knew that had the challenge been made at sea, their footing would be less certain, their blows more cautious, and their fates perhaps decided by the roll of a wave rather than the swing of a blade. The frost-hardened ground of the holmgang circle creaked under the slow, deliberate steps of the two champions. Hrolf Ketilsson gripped the haft of his axe so tightly the leather wrappings groaned. Across from him, Einar of Crossfjord shifted his weight, the long blade of his sword glinting pale in the morning light. Around them, the crowd had fallen silent, the restless murmur of moments ago replaced by a stillness so complete that the sigh of the sea beyond the bay could be heard. The law speaker stood at the edge of the circle, eyes fixed on both men. He lifted his hand. For an instant, time seemed to hold its breath. Then the hand fell, and the duel began. They did not rush each other. This was not the wild chaos of a shield wall breaking, nor the reckless fury of a raid. This was measured death. Einar moved first, a half step forward, his sword held high in a guard that promised both defense and sudden attack. Hrolf answered with a slow pivot, keeping the head of his axe low, its bearded edge hanging like the jaw of a patient predator. The first exchange came quick. Einar feinted high, drawing the axe up to meet him, then snapped his blade down toward Hrolf's thigh. The axe moved like a striking hawk, knocking the sword aside with a harsh clang of steel on steel. Hrolf stepped in close, swinging for Einar's ribs, but the swordsman twisted away, his shield absorbing the blow with a thud that sent a shiver up his arm. They circled again, boots grinding frost into powder, each watching for the smallest opening. A duel of this kind was as much a battle of patience as of skill. One wrong move, one overreach, and the fight would be decided in a heartbeat. Hrolf was the first to test the edge of recklessness. With a low growl, he swung high and hard, the axe whistling through the air toward Einar's helm. Einar caught the blow on his shield, but the force of it staggered him, driving him back a step toward the boundary. The crowd's breath caught one more step, and he would be out of the circle. But Einar steadied himself, eyes never leaving his opponent. Now the pace quickened. Einar pressed forward, sword darting in and out like the thrusts of a serpent. Twice his blade scored shallow cuts on Hrolf's arm, the red welling bright against the pale morning. Hrolf's teeth bared in a grimace, but he gave no ground. Instead, he began to turn each cut into an opening, letting Einar's blade slide just far enough past his guard to make space for a counterstrike. It came in a sudden, brutal moment. Einar thrust for the chest, and Hrolf knocked the sword aside with the haft of his axe, stepping in close enough to feel the heat of his opponent's breath. The axe's bearded edge hooked over the rim of Einar's shield and wrenched it downward. The gap was there, the space between shoulder and neck, and Hrolf moved to take it. But Einar was ready. His shield hand dropped the board entirely, freeing his arm, and his sword came up in a vicious backhand slash. Hrolf's axe blow missed its mark by the breadth of a finger, and steel bit into his shoulder with a sound like a butcher's cleaver striking bone. The crowd roared. Blood poured down Hrolf's arm, dripping from his fingers. He staggered, but he did not fall. Instead, he shifted his grip, moving the axe into his left hand awkward, but serviceable. Einar's eyes narrowed. The wound had weakened his foe, but the fight was far from over. What followed was a blur of steel and breath and frost. Hrolf fought like a man who knew he had but a few good strikes left in him, each swing of the axe a measured gamble. Einar's sword worked tirelessly, probing for the final cut, testing the wounded arm's defense. The crowd leaned in, their voices rising with each near miss, the tension wrapping the circle like an iron band. Then the end came as quickly as a snowstorm off the sea. Einar stepped in with a thrust aimed high. Hrolf's left arm swept the axe up, knocking the blade just far enough aside for him to twist his body. The motion carried the axe in a rising arc, its bearded edge catching Einar under the chin. The sound was muffled steel through mail, then through flesh, and then Einar was falling, his sword tumbling from limp fingers. He hit the ground hard, blood blooming dark against the frost. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the whisper of the wind over the bay. Then the law speaker stepped forward, raising his hand toward Hrolf. "Victory!" The crowd erupted, the sound carrying out over the water, like the call of war horns. Some cheered for the champion who had fought through pain to claim the win. Others stood in stunned silence, mourning the fall of a great fighter. Supporters of both men moved forward, some to lift Hrolf on their shoulders, others to gather Einar's still form from the frozen ground. The blood price had been paid. The river valley was won for Jarl Svein, and the law had spoken. But in the eyes of those who watched, the duel would not be remembered for land or law alone. It would be remembered for the moment when two warriors, each worthy of song, met in the circle and fought until one could no longer stand. When the law speaker's voice rang out over the frost-bound ground, declaring Hrolf Ketilsson the victor, the duel's purpose, at least in the eyes of the law, was fulfilled. The claim to the fertile river valley passed to Jarl Svein, and the matter, in theory, was settled. But in the Viking world, the end of a holmgang was rarely so simple. What followed was a different kind of battle, fought not with blade and shield, but with words, oaths, and the shifting tides of loyalty. Hrolf stood in the center of the circle, chest heaving, the haft of his axe slick with blood. His shoulder wound ached with every breath, but he kept his posture straight. He had to, for now, more than ever. The crowd's eyes were upon him. His victory was fresh, and its meaning was still taking shape in the minds of all who had seen it. Any sign of weakness, any stumble in bearing, could sour the moment. Einar of Crossfjord lay at the edge of the hide, tended by his men. The cut under his chin had been deep, and the dark stain spreading across the snow told the truth. He would not see another dawn. His followers murmured in low voices, some with grief, others with the grim fury of men who had seen their champion fall. They looked toward Hrolf, not with the respect due a victorious warrior, but with eyes that weighed vengeance. The law required that the losing side accept the outcome, yet acceptance and forgiveness were different things. Jarl Hakon, Einar's lord, had not yet spoken. He stood among his men, his face unreadable, hands clasped behind his back. His silence was heavy, and those who knew him understood that it was the silence of calculation. He had lost a valued champion, and with him, the valley. To leave such a loss unanswered would be to admit weakness, but to challenge the verdict would be to defy the law in the sight of all. Meanwhile, Jarl Svein stepped forward, flanked by his retainers. His expression was one of satisfaction, but his voice, when he spoke, carried the measured tone of a man who knew victory was only the first step. He praised Hrolf's courage, saluted Einar's valor, and spoke the formal words claiming the valley. His men echoed his claim, their voices carrying over the crowd like a rolling wave. The onlookers knew these words would be repeated in the Thing, and in every hall from the fjords to the inland valleys. The claim was now Svein's, by right of holmgang. Yet, even as the formalities unfolded, the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. The duel had been clean. No one could claim the rules were broken, but in the heat of rivalry, clean victories could sting most of all. Whispers passed through the crowd. Would Hakon bide his time, striking back in some other way? Would the death of Einar demand blood in return, sparking a new feud? The duel had averted a larger war for now, but the seeds of conflict could still take root. For Hrolf, the aftermath was both triumph and burden. His name would be sung in the mead halls, his fame carried by poets and traders. But fame was a double-edged gift. Victories in the holmgang drew challenges, for there was no surer way for an ambitious warrior to make his own name than to face a man already proven. Rolf knew that today's victory might be the first of many such tests, each more dangerous than the last. In the hours after the duel, the practical matters began. Witnesses and heralds carried word of the outcome to the Thing, where it would be recorded. Svein's men began speaking of the valley as theirs, making plans for the grazing of cattle and the collection of rents. Hakon's men, grim-faced, made their preparations to leave. Between the two camps, there was no open hostility, not yet, but the air was taut with the weight of unspoken words. Among the common folk who had come to watch, the talk turned quickly to storytelling. The fight was already being reshaped in the telling. Rolf's wound deepened, Einar's sword strokes faster, the final blow more dramatic. Some swore the gods themselves had guided the victor's hand. Others claimed it had been sheer mortal skill. These versions would grow and change with each retelling, and within weeks the duel would be half legend, woven into the fabric of local memory. As for the dead, Einar's body would be carried home to his kin, laid out in the longhouse with his sword at his side. Songs would be sung for him, and his deeds recounted, including the last how he had stood in the holmgang against one of the coast's fiercest champions. His name would not vanish, but neither would the sting of his loss fade quickly. Night fell early that winter day, the bay dark under the weight of low clouds. Fires were lit in the hall where Hrolf and Svein's men gathered. Cups of mead were raised, the victory celebrated with heavy voices and the pounding of fists on tables. But even in celebration, there was a note of watchfulness. The holmgang had brought them the valley, but the cost in blood and in the wary eyes of their rivals would be measured in the seasons to come. In the end, the aftermath of the duel was like the sea after a storm. The waves seemed to calm, the wind to ease, yet under the surface the current shifted, carrying the promise of future tempests. The holmgang had decided the matter for now, but in the north, nothing stayed settled forever. Long after the frost had melted from the dueling ground by the bay, and the blood of Hrolf and Einar had seeped into the frozen earth, the memory of their holmgang lingered in the mouths of the people. The circle of hide was gone, the stakes pulled up, but the story had taken root, and in the Viking world, stories were stronger than stone. The first to keep it alive were those who had stood in the crowd, farmers returning to their fields, traders loading their ships, and fishers setting their nets, all carried the tale home. Each told it in their own way. In one telling, Hrolf fought on despite a wound that would have felled a lesser man, striking his final blow with the strength of Thor himself. In another, Einar's sword sang like a river in flood, pressing his enemy to the very brink before fate turned against him. The truth became a thread running through many versions, woven tighter with each retelling. In the halls of Jarl Svein, the duel became proof of his rightful claim to the river valley. Guests to his table heard of how his champion had fought with honor, how the gods themselves must have favored him. The valley's wealth, its fertile meadows, its steady waters for fishing and travel, became a living testament to the victory. Svein's rivals would remember the duel too, but for them, it was a warning of his reach and of the champions who stood at his side. In Jarl Hakon's hall, the memory took a darker cast. Einar's fall was told, not as a failure, but as the noble death of a loyal retainer. His name was spoken with respect, his courage upheld as an example for the young men training in the yard. Yet behind the praise ran a current of bitterness. The loss of the valley was an old wound that would never quite heal. For some in Hakon's circle, the duel was not a settled matter, but an unfinished chapter, waiting for the right moment to be reopened. Beyond the Jarls, the story entered the sagas. Poets, skalds began to shape it into verse, fitting the clash of axe and sword into the patterns of alliteration and rhythm that would carry it down the generations. A good saga was more than history, it was a vessel for meaning. In the telling of Hrolf and Einar's fight, the skalds found themes as old as the North itself, the weight of honor, the price of loyalty, the fine edge between fate and choice. Over time, the duel began to influence more than memory. At the Thing, men cited it when debating disputes over land, pointing to its clean conduct as proof that the holmgang, when done rightly, could settle even the fiercest quarrels. Others used it to argue the opposite, that even a lawful duel could deepen enmity and plant the seeds of future war. It became a touchstone in the ongoing conversation about whether the holmgang was a safeguard of peace or a danger to it. Among warriors, the fight took on a life of its own as a measure of skill. Young fighters boasted of how they would have fared against Hrolf or Einar, using the story as a whetstone for their own ambitions. Some imitated the tactics they had heard, described the hooking sweep of Hrolf's axe, the lightning backhand of Einar's sword, trying them in training yards and practice bouts. The duel became not just a memory, but a lesson. In families, the memory bound kin together. The descendants of Hrolf carried the pride of his victory, their name forever linked to the duel by the bay. The descendants of Einar carried the memory of his courage, the duty to honor him by their own deeds. Feasts in both houses would see the story told again, not always in the same words, but always with the same fire. As the years turned to decades, the holmgang at the bay became part of the region's identity. Travelers passing through would be shown the spot where the duel was fought, the old men pointing with gnarled hands to where the circle had once been marked. The younger ones, who had never seen it, would speak as though they had, their minds filled with the images handed down to them: frost underfoot, breath in the air, the ring of steel in the cold. The duel also became a part of the broader history of the holmgang itself. Scholars and storytellers, looking back from later centuries, would mark it as one of the last great duels fought under the old rules before the practice began to fade. In the growing towns, law was shifting toward fines, arbitration, and the authority of chieftains rather than the naked judgment of the duel. Yet the holmgang at the bay remained in memory, as a moment when the old way still burned bright, fierce and clear as a winter sun. In this way, Hrolf and Einar's fight lived on, not in the ground where they stood, not in the valley whose fate they decided, but in the minds and tongues of all who carried their names. The holmgang was never only about the moment of the clash. It was about what followed, the ripples that spread outward into families, alliances, and the very shape of the law. And in this, their duel was a perfect example. Generations later, when the bay lay quiet and the duel's exact date was forgotten, the story still flared to life whenever a skald raised his voice in the mead hall. Listeners would lean in, drawn again into that cold morning when two champions met in the circle, and the fate of land and honor hung on the swing of an axe and the flash of a sword. For as long as the story was told, the holmgang would not be over.